Welcome to tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Thanks for joining us. Tonight we feature Dr. Brian Steele Wills to discuss two of his books, Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Deaths in the Civil War, and Confederate General William Dorsey Pender, The Hope of Glory. This series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're happy to be able to bring these programs to you live via the virtual platform. And if you're not already a member of Civil War Talk, we'll be providing membership information a little bit later in the program and hope you'll all join.
Dr. Brian Steele Wills is director of the Center for the Civil War Era and professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. In 2020, Dr. Wills was the recipient of the Frank E. Vandiver Award of Merit by the Houston Civil War Roundtable. The Vandiver Award recognizes outstanding contributions to Civil War scholarship or preservation efforts by an individual or an institution in the U.S. Dr. Wills is the author of a number of Civil War books, including The Confederacy's Greatest Cavalryman, Nathan Bedford Forrest, George Henry Thomas, As True as Steel, The River Was Dyed with Blood, Nathan Bedford Forrest and Fort Pillow, and Gone with the Glory, The Civil War in Cinema. Tonight, Dr. Wills will answer questions about George H. Thomas and Nathan B. Forrest, two of the most fascinating Civil War personalities. Dr. Wills will also discuss Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Deaths in the Civil War, and Confederate General William Dorsey Pender, The Hope of Glory. Inglorious Passages received the Harwell Award at the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable for the best book of 2017, and it was a finalist for the 2017 Emerging Civil War Book Award. Please join me in welcoming Brian Steele Wills.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoy the opportunity to share what I've written and the interest we all share together with any audience. And this is a superb audience. I already see so many people that I know in other settings and other circumstances, and I'm glad to be able to see them again, some of them. So thanks for having me here.
I'm going to go ahead and share your screen for you.
All righty.
There we go.
What I thought I would do is just kind of go through a couple things. You had mentioned some of the books that I've written, and I would talk a little bit about some of the pieces of, I think, fascinating elements or aspects of this. And then when I finish, we can come back to whatever seems to be of more interest. Each one of the slides has sort of a snapshot of some element, and understand that if we were to go into depth on any of this, we could spend time, quite a considerable amount of time, on either of any of these books, or even any of the slides themselves. It's almost like they're a wealth of information among themselves. I've tried to throw a few quotes in. I'm not going to read every quote to you, but some of them are kind of fascinating. And again, they sort of tap into a lot of the different pieces of what I think made this topic interesting to me. I grew up with history and I've lived with history all my life. And one of the things that always drives me is to try to understand why things happened or why people did what they did. And when I got to this, really one of my more recent books, I was trying to understand kind of when people went off to war, why things happened to them and what types of things happened to them. And my first inclination was to have this ability to go in and look at all the diaries and letters and journals and newspaper accounts and basically cover the entire gamut of what could happen to someone who was not killed by an enemy force in anger, so that if you were killed either in friendly fire or from disease or from accident or some other aspect, I wanted to be able to tell that story. And I really thought I was going to be able to cover it all. And of course, as you get into it, not the least because most people died of disease, so you can really only tap into some of that. You really can't cover any aspect of this in total. As you can probably imagine, since the book came out, I've had many examples that I would have put in the book had I known they existed or had I learned of them at the time. But as I say, if you're waiting to write the perfect book, you'll never finish anything, because you'll just keep sitting there and adding and adding. And then nobody will publish the book because it's too big and it's too costly. But this little excerpt comes from William Fox's Regimental Losses in the American Civil War. And he's mostly, of course, focusing on the federal side of things, but he touches on just how many ways in which people met their final accounting, for lack of better terms. I kind of looked at it as a journey, and when you end life's journey, how did you reach the end of that journey? And I was thinking of a title many years ago when I was kind of contemplating this, and I thought about, we always think of war as quote unquote glorious, and the passage of life as being a glorious passage. And yet so many of these people died in ways that was certainly inglorious. And yet the chairs at homes that they left were still vacant. It did not matter that they didn't fall at Gettysburg or didn't fall at Vicksburg or Chickamauga or in a naval battle or some other hostile action. They died because they drowned, or they died because they suffered from sunstroke, or they died because of even suicide. And so whatever it is that caused their deaths, those seats were still empty. But I thought the notion of inglorious passages was really a good way to capture that spirit of that. And later on, I was reading a diary, an account by a chaplain who said that he was riding with his command across a river, swollen river, on the back of an animal that lost its footing, and he was thrown into the water. And as he struggled to come to the surface, he wondered, what would happen if I was never to be found, or, what would people think of this inglorious way of dying? And so I thought it was sort of like a divine intervention of telling me that you've got the right idea in mind for a title. So that's why I stuck with that title. Sometimes you get to keep a title and sometimes you don't, just to give you the idea of how powerful authors are. My book on Nathan Bedford Forrest, which was actually my first book, was called A Battle from the Start. He had said that my life has been a battle from the start. And when Kansas wanted to reprint it, they said, well, we would like to come up with a different title. And I said, well, I like my title and I want to keep that. And they said, well, we would like to reprint your book. I said, no, you don't understand. I'd like to keep my title. I said, no, you don't understand. We would like to reprint your book. So I ended up being called the Confederacy's greatest cavalryman, which you can argue about whether that's true. I know Norman's on here as well, and he can tell you, you can argue about whether Forrest is a cavalryman or person who used horses to arrive on or off a battlefield. And so, the notion that I had to change it from a battle from the start, which I really liked, seemed to be less important of what I thought than perhaps what the people marketing the reprinted volume thought. So you never know. You get to keep the title sometimes and you don't. And sometimes I've fought to keep a title that I really liked, or in some cases I got to keep the title regardless because they didn't fight that much over it. But I love this quote from Milton Barrett, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen, and it's a classic sort of phonetic thing. Their vacants, as in vacancies in the ranks, can be filled with others, but in the circle of friends at home and around the fireside, they never can be filled. And I thought that captured that spirit as well. And then the quote for a Union officer who had died and died of disease and yet sacrificed his life on his country's altar as surely as he would have had he been killed by enemy fire. So we'll move to the next slide. And I'll leave this for half a second for you to kind of guess what the sign of trouble here might be. And in case you can't pick it up amidst all of the activity, we'll hit it one more time and you can see the arrow, and the arrow will tell you that something is amiss because if your eye goes now to the top of the boxcar, that is a boxcar on a train that has lots of men gathered on top of it. We go to the next slide and you can kind of begin to see why that caught my attention. There's an actual wartime photograph of the same phenomenon of men who would be uncomfortable in the boxcar, so they gather on top where they can get fresh air and they can stretch their legs and all the rest. And yet you can kind of see from Henry Lake, they may have an unfortunate situation where in fact it says he fell asleep and fell off and was run over and killed. And then another man is killed by his head coming in contact with a bridge. Well, a low bridge and your head up can be an unfortunate outcome, to say the least. One of the books I wrote was on Southeastern Virginia. I called it The War Hits Home, and it actually was true on multiple levels. The book came out at the same time. In fact, I sent my parents a copy of it at the same time as 9/11. So it was the war hit home in a lot of ways, both in terms of the wartime experience, but also personal for our current events, but then also personal to me because it was about the region that I grew up in Suffolk, Virginia. And that's actually an image from Suffolk, a wartime image from Harper's. And I did pick one item there to show you that, again, you can meet your fate into any number of circumstances, and an open drawbridge and a train don't usually do well for you if you're traveling on that train. And the captain who was actually in charge of the commissary at Suffolk ended up being killed in an accident from an open drawbridge. And we won't, again, read each one of these, but you can get the idea of it that multiple newspaper accounts or diaries, journals, other things, letters will tell about incidents that have occurred. So some of these are things that people have actually witnessed and see, some of them what they heard about. So I didn't try to go through and verify every single event. That wasn't my purpose, was to try to catalog and verify everything, but just to give a sense of what people were seeing and experiencing and the ways that they communicated that to each other and to their loved ones at home. We'll go ahead and flip to the next slide. Again, you can kind of see in the newspaper's accounts, like a Cleveland Morning Leader, where they've actually summarized a lot of the different ways that one can be killed in relationship to a train, but derailments was certainly another factor. And then one of the more tragic things, if you're hauling equipment, hauling, in this case, cannon artillery pieces, and your job is to sort of at least watch over those, or to be a sentry, or maybe even you're catching a ride, and yet if something amiss occurs, it can be something that's fatal. And one of the artillery pieces broke loose and crushed Private John Collins. And you can again see kind of images, both wartime images and also some artist renderings. And then there's one example of one of the official record cards that talks about killed when the cars, meaning the train cars, ran off. And derailments happened a great deal in the war, because especially for the Confederacy, the rail lines deteriorated, and you could have accidents that occurred because of that. You could have accidents where on a single track, a train is coming from one direction and a train is coming from another direction. And if they meet in an unfortunate way, people can be killed. And that always struck me as I read these various accounts, that this might be the toll that you would see from a skirmish or a small engagement. And yet in this case, these were not people killed in battle. They were killed in transport accidents or some kind of other. Steamboat explosions was another one, but steam could cause deaths on the rails as well. Any kind of boiler explosions, again, could be horrific in the toll that they produced. So we'll hit the next slide. Death on the water, I just kind of summarized things. Again, I mentioned steamboat explosions there. You see an example of that on that woodcut image. I say the sad fate of John F. Van Nest. This was an individual who was actually on blockade duty and was off the coast of Florida and watched as disease ravaged the crew and slowly caused the deaths of comrades until the point that his mental health was affected. It got so affected, in fact, that he ended up committing suicide. He ended up jumping off of the ship because he simply couldn't take the circumstances anymore. The Monitor, we all know the famed Virginia and Monitor Battle of the Ironclads. It's of such historic impact, and yet the Monitor goes down off of the coast of North Carolina, and the graveyard of ships takes another vessel to the bottom and takes 16 crew members with it. I put the picture at the bottom just to remind all of us that death did not necessarily have to come in these dramatic fashions. It could come in as simple a way as trying to go take a bath or to swim or whatever. One of the more dramatic, I guess, stories was a fellow who was actually fishing with another comrade, fell out of the boat, and then they noticed that there was a fin nearby, and apparently a shark decided that he would have a meal, and that person was never seen again. Many different ways that these individuals could die, with vessels and craft that swamped or were overloaded or were rickety or are in no good condition to be carrying the numbers of troops that they were carrying. But that image at the bottom is simply men trying to bathe, and sometimes you get cramps or you would have currents or whatever that again would cause people to as simple an activity as bathing lead to their passage. And I will say, while I'm on the water, there's one of the stories that I thought was the most fascinating story of the book was a story about a mortar man, person's firing mortars on the Mississippi River. And he's walking along carrying a cask of black powder that was open cask of black powder, smoking a cigar. And in one of the diary accounts, it's very short and simple. It doesn't give big description about it. It just says simply, he blew his head off. Those mortar men are always said to be careless. So that poor fellow had an inglorious passage because of his own stupidity. One hesitates to say that people that in the past that we want to admire for the things that they did could possibly not be the smartest people in the world, but some of these people were not the smartest people in the world. The accidents that took place between individuals from either neglect or simply foolishness. There'll be times where someone they'll be practicing bayonet practice and they go too far, or they're doing some other things that you just wouldn't imagine would end in tragedy, and they do. A round is not expected to be in a chamber, and it is. So many things are happening. A man comes off of picket duty, throws his weapon into the corner of the building. The round goes up through the floor and kills a man sleeping in his bed above. So these kinds of things were certainly inglorious. We'll hit this next slide again. Danger of just routine activities. I often think this actually example comes out of my Suffolk book as well, the Southeastern Virginia book, The War Hits Home. The story about Dennis McCarthy, who's only 22 years old, and he's just doing simple duties that you would have expected would be common duties, clearing trees to try to put earthworks into place and or clear fields of fire. And one of those trees comes down unexpectedly and hits him in the wrong way and leads to his death. You know it's your time when you're out in the woods and you hear basically something that gives you warning, and you step out of the way of one tree only to then be hit by another. So you know that's your time. People ask me what's the strangest way that someone died, I guess, other than smoking a cigar and blowing your head off. One person did supposedly die of a snake bite, but it was because the leg got infected and then they amputated it, and he died actually as a result of the amputation. So you can say the snake is indirectly responsible. On the Mississippi, they love to tell the stories about people eaten by alligators, but there's no direct story about that. My friend Bob Crick will tell you that no one ever froze to death in the Civil War, but there are instances of people that certainly thought that they had seen evidence of folks who had frozen to death. One of those is about a group stranded on an island in one of the small islands on the Mississippi River. Another one is a fellow who basically just got drunk, fell asleep, and then froze to death as a result of not being able to take care of himself. We know alcohol and cold temperatures do not always mix as well as we'd like to think. The two images at the top are pictures of men marching. Sunstroke and other weather-related accidents and incidences are part of this story as well. Lightning strikes. You know, we know that some of the dramatic things of the way that storms will hit and trees and other things are hurled around and folks perish as a result. And of course, people standing under the trees if lightning strikes it or they get somehow struck more directly themselves. But lightning is certainly one of the ways that people died, sunstroke and all of the other things you can think of from just simple activities of marching and moving and going from point to point. We'll hit the next slide. I say not so friendly fire here. And if you'll notice, this is an example of, again, someone who doesn't realize that he's doing something that's going to result in the death of a comrade. But this individual, the fire goes off accidentally, comrade to comrade, friend to friend, and it leads to his death. And one of the more tragic things is that this individual that perished got a chance to go home, then of course re-enlisted, but he'd been home on a brief furlough where he got married. So here he was just recently married, and now his young bride is a widow. We'll hit the next slide. This was a comment by one of the Union generals that simply makes a statement that when people do dumb things, it seems like they don't necessarily pay the price. And here you had people that were pouring powder from shells, most of the time not to try to conserve the powder or to reuse it, but just out of curiosity. Maybe one of the dumbest things that you can imagine was the person who decided the way that he would tell if there was any more powder in the shell was to drop a candle in and see for himself. So you can imagine how that turned out. But anyway, this whole comment about the fact that never the original idiot seemed to be injured from the thing that was done that cost someone else their lives. We'll go ahead and very quickly, I'll just say friendly fire in a different way. We all know about, I'm sure, about William Bull Nelson, one of these larger than life personalities, and frankly, a person that was probably as profane a human being as it could ever be. And little Jefferson Columbus Davis, who ends up deciding that his only chance for confronting the big bully is to shoot him. And so at the Galt House, that takes place where Davis kills Nelson. Edgar Kimball had come to Suffolk to serve in the defense of that town there in 1863 when the fiery Irish General Michael Corcoran shows up. And one of the men on duty has the effrontery to demand that Michael Corcoran give the countersign. And Corcoran says he's not going to do it. Well, Kimball had been drinking a little bit, and I think he'd heard the altercation and decided to come out and assert himself. And unfortunately for him, that just brought about his death when Corcoran basically took affront at that and then shot him down. And there was almost a moment where those individuals ended up having a riot, a mutiny occur over that incident. from the men who supported Kimball and served under Kimball against Corcoran. But cooler heads prevailed. One of the men that I hope maybe one day I can write a book about, a guy named George Washington Getty, got things calmed down. Getty is a sort of an unsung hero of the Civil War on the Union side, was very, very competent, very good almost at every stage I've ever seen him on. And he certainly was very good at Suffolk. And then, of course, Jackson. We all know that Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall, will be hit by friendly fire at Chancellorsville. I'll go ahead and hit the next slide. The other book that was sort of highlighting tonight was my book on William Dorsey Pender. I like biography because I like to understand these people, sort of see what makes them tick. And I did that, I think, with William Dorsey Pender, with George Henry Thomas, and with Nathan Bedford Forrest. So some people that I thought I just wanted to know better, to get to know better and understand better, and writing about them is certainly one way of spending a great deal of time with them, and you learn something of their personality. Pender was a young officer, a young man, and he had just recently been married. He was married in 1859, and he will go off to war. He'd only graduated from West Point in 1854, so he hadn't been out of the point that long. Actually served in the far Northwest in Washington and Oregon, and actually, while he was on sort of his duty took him away from the fort, he got angry because his wife was showing interest in continuing her social activities. And one of those social activities was dancing. And one of the things that he really chided her for was dancing with the post commander, Captain Andrew Jackson Smith. Those of you who are Forrest people or even Thomas people will know Smith from other circumstances. But so he told her basically, I don't want you dancing with anyone, but particularly I don't want you dancing with him. I don't like that. And when he went to Suffolk, because Pender will be in North Carolina as essentially a glorified drill sergeant for a period of time, trying to get men ready for war. And then he finally gets sent up into Virginia. His first post is at Suffolk, and was at Suffolk. He really is the belle of the ball. I mean, he is being invited to every activity that people in the area want to put on or want to have a soldier attend or an officer attend. And he writes to his wife. His wife was Fanny. He writes Fanny all of these letters telling her about all of these things, and very vivid detail. In other words, as my uncle once said, he said, this guy's almost like a lamb in the sense that he's so innocent, he doesn't understand how dumb he is, because he's telling her all of the attention that he's getting and talking about what all this means. At one point, he will say the colonel, meaning him, the colonel is quite a lion. And so he's having a big old time. But one of the things he tells her is that he has had a woman in the community offer to make a hairnet, offer to do things for himself. And he said, well, I don't want you to do anything for me, but you can make a hairnet for my wife. And she says, well, I don't want to do anything for her, but I will do anything for you. And then he writes all of this to his wife. They already have a child. They've also had some difficult circumstances. She's lost a child. So here she's back home, and he's writing all these things. And he goes on and on telling her that she's flirting with me and blah, blah, blah. And so finally she writes a letter that starts read to end. And if you ever get a letter that says read to end, it'd probably be better. Nick Paserno was talking about having letters in envelopes. It's probably better not to take it out of the envelope. It's probably better just to get rid of that. But instead he reads it. And in it, she quotes him and tells him all of the things about the family and things that are typical that you might see, but then quotes him about all these things he said to her. And then she says, in your sober senses, why did you say these things? Why did you say something like that? Did you want to make me jealous? Blah, 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 blah. And so she just lays him out. And it's very strong letter from this wife who's had enough. She's not going to take anymore. And her husband, who's as proud as a peacock, who's about to get that pride hammered down. He will write at the bottom of the letter, the reason that it survives is that it's sent back. And it has at the bottom a little note from him. In the bottom it says, tonight this war holds no more terrors for me. And so it goes back to her. And then later on in another letter where he's behaving himself more appropriately and not saying what he shouldn't be saying to begin with, and not even doing what he shouldn't be doing perhaps. But he says, my dancing days are over. And I always thought that was a great line from William Dorsey Pender, as he's learning to be a husband, a father, a general, because ultimately he is going to be promoted to general, a soldier, and a Christian. One of the other things I think is very interesting about this is she's very religious and he is not. And you sort of watch that evolution as her influence gains greater traction on him as time goes on. I think that's the thing that we forget about these individuals, that they were real people that had real struggles and real lives. And so he's learning to be a lot of things, sometimes painfully, but he's learning nonetheless. And I called the subtitle, The Hope of Glory. Actually, I originally had wanted it to be The Hope of Glory, the Confederate General William Dorsey Pender, and they flip-flopped it, which is fine. But the hope of glory that he could attain on earth, as he's really always interested in promotion and all of these other things, but also heavenly glory. And I think one of the things that he ends up doing is he is saved. He's going to be baptized in front of his regiment. And for a fairly quiet man, he writes a lot and has a lot of opinions, but he doesn't really kind of carry himself out in the public that much. But in these private ways, in these important ways. But he does end up being baptized in front of his regiment, and ends up being some tracts that end up being passed out that use him as an example of religion and service and all of those things that reflect what his new focus is, not just on his own earthly advancement, but on his heavenly future as well. And he will say that he wants to go home. He hopes to go home and spend his time with the family. They'll end up, every time she comes to visit, she goes home and there will be another addition to the family. So they continue to have the hope of having that family enjoy a time of peace at some point down the line. But he says, if that isn't possible, if I can't come home and sit with you under the tree and on the farm, if I can't do that sort of thing, and he is not really a farmer, but if he says, if I can't do that, I do want the hope of being reunited with you in heaven, that we will be together again down the line for eternity. Go ahead and flip the next slide. And unfortunately for Pender, that is going to be the outcome. He's still in his 20s, his late 20s, but he's still in his 20s when on the second day at Gettysburg, he's going to be badly injured and end up being knocked out of action. He then is brought back to Virginia, where at Stanton, Virginia, he ends up having a blood vessel that they had tried to mend and repair, break loose again, and he starts to bleed out. And then the question is that damage so great that he will be, the other things will cause trouble for him. If we want to try to save his life, we may have to take extreme measures to do it. And they decide to amputate the leg, and within a few hours after the amputation, he's killed. His wife is on the way to see him when he is taken in and the leg amputated, and then he dies from the effects of that operation. She does not get to be with him at the very end, but she will, of course, remain true to his memory and remain true to. She'd always really thought that this Gettysburg thing, which of course they didn't know was Gettysburg, this move into Pennsylvania, might not turn out well. I mean, she was very anxious about it, and it turned out she was right, that it did not turn out that well. He was close to Ambrose Powell Hill, and it was A.P. Hill who will say that no one fell at Gettysburg who had more promise than Pender. And supposedly Lee is supposed to have said that we would have done better at Gettysburg but for the loss of Pender. So, there are some quotes that are some questions about just whether those were actually statements made and how much corroboration can be made for those things or not. But that was one of them that supposedly Lee said, again, but for Pender. Well, certainly Hill knew Pender very well, and they had served, Pender had served under Hill, and of course had moved up the ranks to take command of the Light Brigade himself. So as things moved, Pender had moved. And unfortunately for Pender, he was a sort of a magnet for bad things to happen. Almost every engagement he's in, once he gets into active campaigning, results in some wound of some form or fashion. And of course, the worst is the one he suffers at Gettysburg. Go ahead and hit the next slide. This is just a last little sort of image of Pender's last resting place. And you can see that one of the quotes that he makes is that his only really regret from all of this is that he will not be able to be with his wife and the two children. He doesn't know that there's another one on the way. So there will be 3 sons that do not get to grow up with their father because he's perished in the performance of his duty. And on his there's a stained glass window that has the quote, "A patriot by nature and soldier by training, Christian by faith." And that's his burial site there at the church in North Carolina where he's buried. And he's a Tarboro boy, so he's from that area. Go ahead and hit it again. We'll talk very quickly about Forrest. I know that was not our big topic tonight, but Forrest has always been fascinating to me. I found him fascinating when I wrote a high school paper on him, and then I continued to write and read about him. He had a lot of interesting elements in his background that will continue to be important to him. He once said he never saw a pen that he didn't think of a snake. And that's why I've put both the snake and the pen together. He only had 6 months of formal education. He struggled with the King's English, but he certainly was not stupid. And anybody that thought he was stupid suffered the consequences. He loved horses and horse racing. He loved telling stories. He usually was the center of the story if he was telling it, whether he really was or not. He loved playing cards for money. And one of the things that was fun for me was to go to Mississippi and the court records and see that they were about to bring him to trial for gambling. And they decided that they really couldn't do that because he wasn't present in the county any longer. Well, he'd gone off to the war, so he wasn't going to do that. Going to face the charges of gambling for money in that Mississippi town. He said, as I mentioned before about the title of my book, my life has been a battle from the start, and that's where I came up with that title. And the image that you see on the cover is actually one my parents gave me when I graduated from high school. So I put that on the cover. And then the other image from the reprinted book, The Confederacy's Greatest Cavalryman, is one of my favorite prints. And you can see Forrest is getting ready to do something to a Union soldier who's confronting him that he will do to 30 enemy soldiers in single-hand combat. That is, dispatch them, take them out. Forrest will lose 29 horses from underneath him, and he will kill 30 enemy soldiers. And he said, supposedly, again, you can question whether the actual statement or not, but it fits his personality, that he was one up on the Yankees for the horses that he lost and the men that he had killed. Go ahead and hit the next slide. I won't read all of these, but it's just a montage of Forrest quotes that really, I think, captures his personality. He believed in leading from the front, of taking men in himself. War means fighting and fighting means killing. So don't, again, be afraid. But I think that second quote over on the right-hand side beside his portrait there is pretty, I think that gets at Forrest too in a really an important way. It says, whenever you meet the enemy, no matter how few there are of you or how many there are of them, show fight. And he might have said fight, F-I-T-E, fight. But if you show more fight, or if you show fight, they will think there are more of you and will not push you half so hard. He knew how to get into the minds of his opponents, and he knew how to take advantage of their uncertainties, of their hesitations. So among the many things that were secrets to his success were his own willingness to exert himself and to be direct and to be bold, to gather information about what was happening around him. And sometimes that was at a glance, and sometimes that was from scouts and others who would come in. One of the nice little quotes at the bottom is after he's made a plan for a raid that ends up being very successful around the Nashville area. One of the, basically a child that he sends out comes back with the best information of anyone. And he says, that damn little boy knew more about this than anybody else and all of my other men put together. And he says that it was just as important for him to, quote, know where they ain't as to where they are. If you're trying to make a raid, you don't want to run into them, you want to avoid them. And then, of course, at some point, you may find some garrison or something that's the situation is rife for you to be able to gobble them up. But bluff and intimidation, Forrest is, of course, supposed to be this killing machine. That's what James McPherson said once about him. He's a killing machine. But he knew that if he had that reputation, that was half the battle. That if he could get you to be convinced that your confrontation with him was not going to end well for you, that he could take advantage of that. And sometimes he did that with bluff. I mean, we did a great Straits raid and had a lot of fun with that. And one of the things you learn from that is how smart Forrest could be on multiple occasions, especially at the end, just manipulating the circumstances to make it appear as if he's got, cannon he didn't have, reinforcements he didn't have, whatever, that would take advantage of even the slightest weakness of his opponent. And one of the things I'll never forget, I got into a little bit of a tiff with when I was a kid. I wrote a letter basically after there'd been an article in the newspaper, and I was saying that Forrest was a pretty good general and saying stuff about him. And somebody wrote back and said, well, how many people did Forrest ever really beat? And he didn't beat anybody that was very successful or very good. And my thought was, well, was he supposed to lose to a few of them to make them look better? I mean, the reason they didn't look good was because he beat them. That was the whole point. So I always thought that was an unusual thing, that somehow because these generals didn't have more success, that somehow they were not as good as generals that someone like a Stewart or someone else, a Morgan or anyone else might face. Go ahead and you can flip on to the next one. This is just another one of those personality kind of things. His understanding of the skier, as he called it, getting the skier in them. But I think even more important is his sense that once you get them broken, you don't just quit and assume that you've won. You've got to keep the skier in them, keep up the skier. And that power that he had of a sense of who he was and what he could accomplish, even in the worst of circumstances. I always think of it, Parker's Crossroads, when he's confronting a federal force and then there's another force coming in from the rear. It was supposed to have been prepared for. He had his brother actually watching the road, but he was watching the wrong road, and the Federals came in. And the way that Forrest figured out something bad had happened was the horse holders suddenly come racing by. Well, they're supposed to be in the safest place out in the rear, out of the way. And when they come racing by, clearly in distress, well, that's not a good sign. And so Forrest went to investigate, and supposedly there were 2 Federals, and he rides up towards them and they call on him to surrender. And supposedly he says to them, well, boys, if you'll wait right here, I will go and get the rest of my command and we'll all surrender to you. So then he turns around and rides off. Now you can probably imagine he does not come back. And so there's probably 2 Yankees that even today are still standing there waiting for him to come back. And they're probably looking at each other and saying, well, we can be corporals. We can be corporals. We can get promoted. And something good just never seems to happen. But Forrest slips out between these 2 forces and lives to fight another day. And interestingly enough, did not look at Parker's Crossroads as a defeat. He looked at it as a success because he had lived to fight another day. And one of the comments that, again, just captures his personality is a young man who doesn't have a weapon anymore. And he says, well, General, what should I do? What can I do? And he says, you can yell, can't you? Because he knew if you'll just do something, make noise, just to do something, that will be a contribution. And then at Murfreesboro, where he has his first big success, he's captured a portion of the Federal forces, but not all of them. And he's being encouraged because they're behind the lines. Let's, take our winnings and leave. Let's get out of here. And he says, I didn't come to make half a job of it. I mean to have them all. And I think that captures his personality too. Go ahead and hit the next slide. And then with Forrest, the whole issue of willingness to kill people. Again, he does know that war means fighting and fighting means killing, and he's not afraid to kill people. He was not afraid to kill civilians. I mean, his own people at different times in his life. He's got his uncle and he are in a street fight. And when it's all over, a couple of the opponents are gone. The uncle's dead too, but the couple of the assailants are dead. So Forrest did not stray away from fighting when he had to, whoever the threat might be. But he's very interesting that Murfreesboro, he takes what he's learned about warfare from others and he begins to apply it. So he was capable of learning lessons and he was capable of using the lessons. Now, some of that might backfire at a later point or later times, but right now, if it works once, it may work again. And you kind of see that in this Murfreesboro ultimatum, where he basically is going to say, if you keep fighting, I can't be responsible for what's going to happen. I don't even know if he knew what an effusion of blood was. Remember, he's got 6 months of formal education. I don't know, somebody probably explained to him what an effusion is, but he knew that it sounded good and it looked good. And he used to say, if it doesn't have the right pitch, give it a new tune. Say it again in a way that does. And show you how nuanced Forrest was. He would say, fetch the artillery immediately. And the person writing out the order would say, bring up the artillery. He says, I don't want you to say, bring up. I want you to use the word fetch. And his explanation for that, his justification for that was that if you say, bring up, they'll think about it. I don't want them to think about it. I want them to do it. Fetch means they'll do it. They'll do it. And here's James Chalmers, who basically says that when he saw that this would work, that he used it again at other circumstances and other occasions when he needed it. And he says, just as he practiced his flank attack, I guess one of our favorite people, we all know him one way or another, is Ed Bars. And Ed would say, Ed and I did a lot of Fort Pillow things, a lot of Forrest things together through the years. But Ed would say, and Forrest would say, well, Confederates, gonna hit the Confederate flank. Well, Forrest was never gonna try to figure out how to say it in the best professional sense. He's gonna say it in the practical sense. And so he's not worried about the classic double envelopment. He's gonna say, hit him on the ends. And classic double envelopment to him meant hit him on the other end too. So hit him on both ends. And so once he learned how to hit him on the ends and that would be better than just smashing yourself up against them in the front, that you might actually get them to break and run and beat them that way, then why not keep doing that? Why not do that as often as you could? And of course, if you can hit them in the rear, so much the better there too. So, Forrest was he was a very practical person. He did not have military training, but he had an instinct of human nature, and he had an instinct of a battlefield, and he knew some basic elements about what would work and what wouldn't work with people, again, that might show the slightest sign of weakness that he could take advantage of. He knew the weather. He knew the ground. We certainly saw that in our Straits Raid tour as we looked at Forrest in numerous occasions, dealing with circumstances that he had to make immediate decisions about and take on different kind of elements. Okay, hit it again. We'll go quickly so toward the end here. If you can hit me one more time. There you go. The myth, the legend, the legacy. I had to put Forrest Gump in there. Who doesn't want to put Forrest Gump? I love the movies anyway, and there's Forrest Gump. But supposedly, Forrest's great statement was that I got there firstest with the mostest. And my lineist has always been that he wouldn't have said it just that way, because that's just not how he would have talked us. Did. And this is a good example, I think, of where he probably said what then gets carried on in a way that he could say it, that would actually fit his character and yet his language style. And he says, "Well, now I don't know about what you all think about it." And where this quote comes from, where a number of Confederate officers are sharing their secrets for what's worked for them, what success has been for them. They're all talking to each other. And I think it had to be a wonderful moment to be there, and you're listening to what they say works, and you're telling them what you think works, and you're sharing these ideas and learning from each other. But he says, my idea is to always get the most men there first. If he could get the most men there first, that was his goal. And so often Forrest would have men spread out because he wanted to figure out where the enemy was going to go. And as soon as he figured out what that trajectory was, where that line of march was, then he would concentrate. And when he concentrated, then he tried to get to that point where he could then block that force or confront that force. So he would try to get the most men there first. And in I love this quote because it's really classic Forrest. And if you can't whoop them, you outrun them. Because we all want to think Forrest, well, I got there firstest with the mostest men and we wonest. Well, no, I got there and we'll take our shot at it. We're going to try to whoop them, but if we can't whoop them, we're going to outrun them and live to fight another day. That's actually Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest III, who was actually shot down over Kiel, Germany. And his memorial stone was just outside of the area where the statue used to be in Memphis, the equestrian statue there where Forrest and Mary Ann Montgomery Forrest were buried. And that's been moved, but he's not actually there. He's actually there in Arlington. He's in Arlington. Okay, very quickly, because I know we're probably running out of time. The movies. I love the movies. I wrote a book about the movies, Gone with the Glory. And the reason I put this in here was because of a couple of things. Number one, Shenandoah is one of my favorite movies of all time. I just think it's a great movie. You can't get too concerned about it being historically accurate or whatever you might learn historically from it. Just remember it's entertainment. And it had some great actors. It had, of course, James Stewart, and that's George Kennedy. James Best, one of my favorite scenes is a James Best scene where he says, "I smell country boys." And they're just, it's just a great movie. And when I saw this with my family, we used to do sort of our church. We would do Sunday's church, and then we'd go out to eat or go to the movies, a matinee. And one of those matinees was Shenandoah. And I always think of the doxology, which is the last scene where the boy is, his dad are going to have a chance perhaps to end that story with a little more happiness than you might imagine. But I won't give away the ending. You can see it for yourself. Hit it again for me one more time. I love just the way history and Hollywood don't always blend. Here's the beautiful Jean Tierney. I don't think she looks quite the same as the historic Belle Star, but you can conclude that for yourself, because those are the images of the historic Belle Star, and those are the images of Jean Tierney, and you can decide whether Hollywood did a good matchup there. But I mean, if you got a chance for glamour on the screen, I'm not sure you would have pulled it off with the look-alike of the historic Belle Star. Hit it again for me. And then Gary Gallagher just chewed this movie to pieces. He talked about it as being lost cause, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. It's a movie with almost every stereotype you can imagine in it, with John Wayne and Rock Hudson and a lot of really fabulous stars. There's one of my favorites, Royal Dano, who is the commander of the Confederates, when John Wayne overruns them and asks them if they understood that Lee had surrendered. And he says, "We received news yesterday." And he says, "Well, then why are you still fighting?" And he says, "Because this is our land and you're on it." And he says, "But we're all Americans." And Royal Dano looks up at him before shaking his hand. He's lost one arm and hand to amputation, but he holds up his good hand. And he says, "That's always," he says, "I know it. We're all Americans. I know it. But that's always been the saddest part of it." And so The Undefeated, you just can't get too serious about it. Just enjoy it as entertainment. It has Merlin Olsen in it. It has Roman Gabriel in it. And I'm a huge Packer fan, but if you've been around for a long time, you'll know Roman Gabriel and Merlin Olsen were the classic Los Angeles Rams players from years and years ago. But you know, don't get too caught up in it. Just try to enjoy it. History is not going to be well treated in Hollywood, and that's just the way it is. Last slide here I have before I'll close my part of this. There's Charlton Heston. You say, "Well, why did you put Moses up here?" My next book is going to be called Running the Race, the Public Face of Charlton Heston. And you say, "Well, what did Charlton Heston have to do with anything?" Well, here he is as Moses, but if you hit it one more time, you notice there he is in a uniform, and there he is on a horse. That is Major Dundee, what he had hoped would be his Civil War epic. And then the last picture there, if you hit it one more time, I think there'll be one more. And there he is with Richard Harris and a whole slew of just great character actors as Confederates that have agreed to get out of prison to help him chase down, that is Charlton Heston and his command chase down Apache warriors who've attacked some civilians in the region. And so his Civil War film is really, you'll see it a lot of times on the Western Channel, and it is in many ways a Western. It's kind of funny how a lot of Civil War movies end up kind of being Westerns. But Charlton Heston has at least a couple Civil War films, because he's actually a former Confederate in one, and he actually played the prosecutor in a version of, it wasn't the one that George C. Scott directed on the Andersonville trial, but he plays in a different version of that as the Union prosecutor of Henry Wirz, the commandant of Andersonville prison. So Heston had a couple Civil War things, but I always liked Heston because he was in historical epics and movies, big movies, and I thought movies ought to be big, and he was in those. So I wrote that book about Running the Race, the Public Face of Charlton Heston, based on the whole book is sort of set up on the kind of the scheme of Ben-Hur and the race, the iconic chariot race of Ben-Hur, with his life as sort of stages of his own race to establish himself, reinvent himself, find a new audience time after time. And frankly, a man who again had been Moses and Ben-Hur ends up being in Planet of the Apes, and Soylent Green ends up being in the disaster films, and then in a lot of other things later in his life. And then, of course, involved in the National Rifle Association near the end of his life, when his last audience may have been his most devoted audience to what he was saying, and not just on screen anymore, but in person. Last thing I think we got is just my books. If you want any of these books, you can get them on Amazon or anything you'd like. But if you want one of them, and I know we'll get some more ways of getting these out to you, this information out to you. But these are the books that I've talked about and some that I haven't. I didn't talk about George Thomas too much tonight, but I can if you would want to hear more about him. I think I wrote the best book on George Thomas. I feel like I did that on Forrest. I know I did it with Pender. So I try to do what I think captures these individuals and gives you the best sense of kind of what I think they bring to us, teach us, show us, inform us about the experiences they had in the world that they lived in. I always tell my students, try to put yourself in the past. Don't try to just judge the past. Understand the past by putting yourself into their positions. And if you've ever asked why, you're on to something, because the why will take care of who, what, when, where, and how. And if history is boring, it's because you don't understand it. And rather than say, I don't understand it, you blame history. It's boring. But if it's boring, you're forgetting that it's the story of people, and people are fascinating. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Laura, for having me here. And I didn't say much about my center, but I can tell you a little bit more about that too. And we've got a lot of great events coming up. A March symposium that I'm really excited about with Jack Davis and Bobby Horton, and I'll do a part of that as well. Our collector showcase in August. We've got a Vince Dooley leadership seminar in the summer. So we've got a lot of good things that we're really excited about.
Well, thank you so much. And we definitely want to hear more about those. I'm sure people are going to have questions. In fact, there's already some questions waiting in the chat box for us.
Right.
So we're going to, yeah, they're lined up waiting for you. So we'll get those questions lined up for you and I'll read them so that you don't have to try to squint at the screen.
Okay.
But before we get started with those questions and answers, I'm going to turn it over to Tina so that she can tell us about the membership benefits at Civil War Talk. Civil War Talk sponsors these programs each week. And so Tina's going to tell us about the membership benefits. And she has just typed into the chat Dr. Will's mailing address. If you want to get those books directly from him, you can order directly from him and he will inscribe those for you. And in a few minutes, I'll go back to that slide so that we can see the pricing for certain ones that you might be interested in. So don't log off if you're planning to order, but with that inscription, that personalized inscription, you can ask him to say anything you want. You can say, he could say, to Laura, from your biggest fan.
Well, my mother says, always asks me, she says, do you make your students call you Dr. Wills? And I say, Mom, they can say anything they want as long as they can repeat it in front of their mother.
Exactly. So yes, postage is $3 per book, but I'm sure he'll probably give you a discount if he can if you order all of them at once. I'm sure you could probably talk him into giving you a better price. But anyway, postage is $3 if you order one book. So we'll show that the slide with the books in just a second. Tina, okay. Let's go to you.
Okay. Well, membership is easy to, excuse me, let me get started again. It's very easy to join Civil War Talk and the community of Civil War Talk. Just go over and register today and you can just, it's a free membership. However, if you want to get rid of the Google ads that are popping up, you can become a premium member for as little as $12 a year. And currently what we have going on is there's two hot threads going. There's a new one called Tool Tuesday, and it's about Civil War tools and that era. And the other one is the best and worst president in US history. And that has had over 83 replies. So you might want to be checking it out. And that's it. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Tina. That's great. Thanks for spotlighting those threads for us too. It's always great to know what threads are coming up and which ones are popular so that we can go check those out. So we are going to, if you are ready, Dr. Wills, I hope you're going to say yes, that you're ready and you're going to answer the questions because I don't want to answer them. We've got quite a few of them. So I am going to put you on the screen and I am going to unshare my screen so that we can bring folks to the screen. I'm going to, Mr. Bredenberg has a live question, but I'm going to start with what's in the chat right now, and I'll get to him in just a second. Mr. Daysinger would like to know, how did Thomas personally feel about his family shunning him, and did he comment specifically on that situation?
That's a really good question. He did, to my knowledge, did not make public comments about any of that, but he was not a public person anyway. And his wife, who was, I think, a stronger, had stronger views and voices than he did on a lot of subjects, including about whether Thomas would have made a choice to go with the South. She will say the general always knew what course he should take. Well, if your wife says you should know what course you're going to take, then you pretty much, she already knows who you are and certainly knows her influence over you. But she will say the general and I never once talked about it. And so if they didn't talk about whether he would join the Southern cause or not, I doubt they talked about his family, and I doubt that they talked anything about what he felt about his family. And to my knowledge, I don't remember seeing anything where he made a comment one way or the other. His brother will say that he did not think that that George had the choice to do other than what he did. So I think that was an interesting statement, but the sisters were not so forgiving. Now, if you go to Southampton County, you can go to this home place and you can see the home. Supposedly the room that he was born in is now a bathroom. But I don't think that's a social comment. I think that's just the modernization of an old house. I don't think they were trying to make a social comment about George Thomas. But, and I think it might even be a half bath. So it's probably not even the whole thing. But the point I'm making is that, he was very devoted to Virginia, to his home, but in a way that was very different than Lee or Stewart or some of the others that were more definite about the choices they felt they had to make. And he always thought that secession was a foolish venture, and that later on when he's given command of a department in the Pacific, which is actually where he'll be when he dies. He dies in 1870, so he doesn't live that long after the war. He goes on an inspection tour of Alaska, and he says that he wishes that they'd had Alaska before the war, because then the hotheads of both sides could have been sent to Alaska. So he's kind of got a wry sense of humor that doesn't always show itself. But I don't think he ever said anything about his family one way or the other, certainly in a negative way.
Mr. Swain commented, was that social distancing?
Yeah, I say so.
Okay, let's see. Tina has a question, and I'm going to let her come live to the screen to ask that, since she's right here instead of reading it for you.
Okay.
There you go.
My question is, on either side, how many people, soldiers, do you think died falling off the top of boxcars? And the other part of that question is, why did anyone think that was a good idea to be riding on top of them? And why did the Army brass allow it? Because it was really a big waste of men and resources to do stupid things like that.
Well, unfortunately, and those are good questions. Unfortunately, the problem for the Army is that they are not as aware of the individual soldier as much as you might want them to be. And frankly, the numbers that would have perished from this would have been small in comparison to many other things. Keep in mind that more people will die of disease and of bullets by great amounts. A lot more will die of disease and bullets. So when you have accidents, there are even smaller numbers of people than those who died of disease by far. And I think what happens was the soldiers sometimes do things on their own. Whether they've been told not to is another issue. And, sometimes they are going to act in the breach of the rule that they've been given, because that's just the way they feel about it. I kind of always think about the whole notion of fragging. The Civil War doesn't have that many incidences of fragging that you have written down, but there are a lot of opinions where an officer has done something that's very unpopular, and to the extreme that some of the men really think that something needs to be done about it one way or another. And maybe one way is to do something, fatal. So soldiers oftentimes do things on their own, whether officers approve of it or not, and they don't listen to what they've been told. Now you ask, why would they do it? If you've been transported inside of a very tight, compartmentalized space where you can't move and you can't breathe and things are, uncomfortable, it doesn't take that long before you'll do just about anything to get out of that. And when you're in a cattle car or a box car, think of a box car, we think of hobos and whatnot from the Great Depression era, and you sort of think of this romantic. Well, that's not the most pleasant way to travel. And when you're packed in with all these other people, the desire to get out somehow, and it makes sense to get up on top of the box car. And then of course you don't think about that you might roll off, or you don't think about that if you're not real careful and there's a low bridge, you might regret it. So how many times has someone done that sort of thing and they've gotten away with it? And so now it just seems to be that may be what will happen until it doesn't. And then you are the exception, and you are the person that didn't get your head out of the way in time, and something really bad happens. So, those are all good questions, but I think what happens is the soldiers did what made the most sense to them at the moment. They didn't think a whole lot about it. And sometimes they paid the price.
I do remember reading in a soldier's diary that he was going to get into the boxcar, but the reason he went on top is in the boxcar, it was over an inch deep in liquid tobacco spit.
Well, that's a thought.
So he decided to take his chances and go on top.
Yeah.
And so they were probably, it was a really pretty dirty time just in general.
Well, we don't have scratch and sniff movies either. So think about it. If you ever did, what sometimes you would be, if you watched, like my wife really loves Yellowstone, and now she's watching this 1883, and that's fine. And I like Tim McGraw and all that crowd, but Yellowstone's much better. It's actually very good. But if you go back in time and you look at the world these people lived in, you really would think of it as an attack on your senses. If you suddenly stepped out of your time machine and walked into some of these circumstances, I mean, it'd be kind of difficult. I mean, you can almost understand why the French come up with perfume.
Thank you. Oops.
Thanks for that question, Tina. I appreciate it. So let's see. Mr. Damon would like to know how was your research, or was your research influenced by the Republic of Suffering, Drew Gilpin Faust's work? And also he says he's reading Ambrose Bierce's stories, and the ghastliness of descriptions seems to be similar to what you're talking about. Oh, you got muted somehow. Can you unmute? Yeah, I don't know.
I will unmute. There we go.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't touch anything, so I don't know what happened. But anyway, no, I love Ambrose Bierce, and Ambrose Bierce has got that wonderful short story about the fellow who's trying to figure out how he can escape from being hanged, and yet he won't, and the occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. But the book that I was writing actually kind of, when you ask where do these ideas come from, Forrest will be what will influence some subsequent things, like the book on Fort Pillow, where I wanted to get more into what happened there and what I thought Forrest's role in that was. And really that book was as much about the excesses of war as it was anything else. It was not meant to just be an assessment moment by moment in detail about Fort Pillow. Some people kind of criticized it because it didn't get, quote, enough into Fort Pillow as much as they thought, when my goal was to try to show that war has terrible moments that occur in it for any number of reasons, and that's happened anytime war has ever happened. So in the history of the United States, if you want to see some nasty fighting, take the Loyalists and the Patriots of the American Revolution. Take the Philippine insurrection that will occur after the Civil War. and take, of course, the Pacific in the World War II and Vietnam, but take all of these things and you kind of can see that war has excessive moments, and Fort Pillow was one of those. So that book, Forrest book, sort of inspired going deeper into Fort Pillow. The Suffolk book that I wrote, which is my second book, The War Hits Home, really inspired a lot of different other books. It's the reason I wrote the book about Pender, because I saw Pender at Suffolk first, and then I wanted to know more about Pender. And Pender had letters and letters and letters, where Forrest had very few. And Thomas didn't have as many because his wife burned a personal correspondence. So, you know, I had challenges because of that. But then with Pender, I had the other challenge. He wrote so much and he had so much to say. And I really enjoyed that, but it came out of the Suffolk book. The other thing that came out of the Suffolk book, long before I ever heard of Drew Faust or knew anything about her, was these incidences where people died in these various circumstances I mentioned. I didn't talk at all about civilians. We could spend forever talking about civilians and the deaths of civilians that are brought about as a result of the war, whether they're in factories and industrial accidents, whether they're disease that ravages communities, whether there's friendly fire or accidents on the battlefield that involve civilians. Just ask Judith Henry at First Manassas. The point I'm making about it is that the Suffolk book then inspired, I think, a lot of the things that caused me to then write Pender and then Inglorious Passages, and that's where that came from.
Okay, thanks. Kathy Springhorn said, she just commented that the governor of Wisconsin, this was when you were talking about Inglorious Passages, the governor of Wisconsin fell between two boats near Shiloh and died.
That's right.
And then she was asking about the crater. Did any of those deaths at the crater count in your assessment? Were there any interesting examples that happened during the Petersburg campaign?
The problem with the crater, of course, is that you're dealing with a combat action. And so what you would be dealing with is fringe things that occur after the fighting is over. And I did have a chapter on justice and that sort of thing, where I talked about deserters, and I talked about the prisons and prison camps and the deaths associated with prison camps. And of course, prisoners and how they're treated have nothing to do with combat. And as you'll learn, if you read the Fort Pillow book and you read the Inglorious Passages, either one, if you take the crater, there's an awful lot that happens after that fighting is over that is much more complicated than we would have imagined years ago when we talked about little Billy Mahone going in and driving the Federals out of the crater or forcing them to surrender or whatever. There's a lot of things that occurred that you kind of associated with Fort Pillow and behavior there that happened at the crater as well. And one of the things that I did try to explain is that, you know, after the Alamo and some of the things that happened in Texas, there wasn't a real big desire on showing mercy to those folks who had caused those massacres at Goliad and at the Alamo and other things. And when you've got, remember, the Alamo, they're chasing basically people who no longer can defend themselves or fight into a swampy region beyond the Battle of San Jacinto. And yet we don't think of Sam Houston as a war criminal. We don't think of him as perpetuating a massacre, because the intent was certainly not to massacre, wipe out people. And of course, with Forrest at Fort Pillow, my argument has always been that if he really wanted to massacre the garrison, he wouldn't have let anybody survive. That would have been the exception rather than the rule. And the numbers do play out in a way that's not complementary to Forrest. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to suggest that. But I am saying that there are prisoners that are taken. There are people that are turned over. Some of the folks that will be testifying in the congressional investigation are people that Forrest, if he'd have wanted to keep their mouths shut, could have kept them from being turned over. He could have just killed them, had them killed. I think what happened at Fort Pillow was that you know, he lost control of the battle, and I have any number of explanations for why I think that occurred. But I believe that he lost control of the battle, and that men did act on their own in ways that he didn't have any power to control or to assert control over that. You know, everybody always wants to say that one of the things that Forrest did was to start the Ku Klux Klan. He did not start the Klan. It started before he became a member of it. Now, once he joined it, he wasn't going to just be a member. He liked to be in charge of things. So he was going to be the man in charge, and he ends up being the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. That is true. He also disbands it at a subsequent point, but partly he disbands it because in Tennessee, where he cared things about politics the most, things were a little different by that point than they had been before. And number two, he couldn't control it. Secret organization, he couldn't tell them what to do and have them actually do it the way he wanted it done. So he said, I'm not going to mess with people that I can't control. And that's the way Forrest was. He was kind of a control freak in that sense. He wanted to have control over the battlefield. And I think that the thing that would have bothered him most about Fort Pillow was that he had not had control the way he would have, as he looked back at it, would have said he would like to have had. Unfortunately for him, by then, of course, what had happened, and that then became a rallying cry in an election year that needed some rallying cries.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Roberts has a comment that I think you're going to like. He said, your publisher was right on renaming the Forrest book. I already had Battle from the Start, but purchased Greatest Cavalryman thinking it was a new book.
Well, bless your heart. Now, let me explain you one other thing that I tried to do to help you. Was I told them, I said, if you're going to change the title, at least put that this was originally published as a Battle from the Start. If you'll flip over to the back of your second book, which keep in mind that if you've got that glorious print on the cover, which I love. So you've at least got that. But when you flip over, it says it, but in very small print on the back.
Okay, some consolation then.
Yes.
Let's see. Sue Ann said, how long there's a couple of questions about William Dorsey Pender and Fanny. She wants to know how long were they married when he went off to war? And someone also asked, did she ever remarry? And then Miss Booth also says, I have such great memories of your talks at the Virginia Tech Civil War weekend and the Roanoke Civil War Roundtable. Hope you come back this way sometime.
Well, I'd love to come back anytime if somebody invites me to come up. I have plans to be in Blacksburg again for a tribute to Bud, and I'm planning to do that and looking forward to that. We're also in our symposium in Kennesaw going to do a tribute to Bud Robertson. He was one of our honorary advisory board members, and we lost him. We lost Wiley Sword, and those are not only great historians and dear friends, but they were associated with our center. And so we're going to actually remember them in our March symposium. Forrest Dorsey and Fanny had not been married that long because, you know, they were both young, and all three of the wives outlived their husbands, and she outlives her husband the most because I think she's not going to die until later, like 1922, I think it is, in the next century. So she lives a long time, and she'll always be Miss Fanny. To her, I think she taught school for a little while, and she was always Miss Fanny. She had the three boys. They will grow up to be important folks in their own communities, lawyers and other prominent figures. I know Dorsey would have been proud. His friend, I'll just say it this way, and so many stories don't have time for them all. The first child is named Samuel Turner. Dorsey Pender's best friend at West Point was Samuel Turner Shepherd. And it was after they had left West Point, and in that first summer where everything's shaking out, that Dorsey came to visit the family home in what was today Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And there was this young sister, this young individual that caught his eye, and that he just fell immediately in love with, Fanny Shepherd. And so it was partly because of the association with the brother that he got to know this young lady that will become his wife. And then, unfortunately for Samuel Turner, he will die fairly quickly from disease at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And I think their shared grief also brought them together. So they kind of had the multiple things that brought them together. And their first child is Samuel Turner, named after this lost brother. And then the other friend of the family was Stephen Lee. And the last child that Pender will never see is Stephen Lee Pender. So it's kind of a couple of interesting things. Another Forrest thing, I'll just say this because it's kind of fun. You know, he had a real reputation, and yet he knew what would make him a better person. So he fell in love with a woman who was very, very different than he was. And when he fell in love with Mary Ann Montgomery, who became Mary Ann Montgomery Forrest, he just totally became immersed in her and wanted to be with her and wanted to marry her. And so he went to her guardian fairly soon after he had gotten to know her a little bit and said, I want to marry her. And the guardian said, for Forrest, you cuss and gamble, and Mary Ann is a Christian girl. And Forrest said, I know, that's why I want her. I thought that was a very interesting thing. I know, that's why I want her. He knew she would make him a better person. And she was the only one who apparently could get that hot temper under control, sometimes just with her presence and maybe a glance, a good look.
There you go. Okay, let's see. Our last question is going to be live, and Mr. Bredenberg has one. So I am going to leave you guys to it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. This has all been really great. In reality, the question that I started with, really, you kind of answered it in a lot of ways, answering Tina's question, because my question, it had to do with all those soldiers on top of the train car.
Right.
But I did want to say that I was interested to hear that Roman Gabriel is in that movie. Not because of Green Bay or anything, but because I'm from Raleigh, where NC State is, and he was the star quarterback, and also one of my daddy's students at the school.
Well, I'll be darned.
That's my connection to Roman Gabriel. I have to go watch that movie now. But I did have a question. Back when I was still young enough to do crazy stuff like this, I was a safety officer for a small construction company. And in those days, you had to have a safety program. You still do now. It's even more stringent. I know back in the Civil War days, they didn't have OSHA. But I was also, I was wondering, the first thing I thought when I saw those soldiers on the train car was, oh no, they're not tied down. And oh no, there's no railings, because that's the automatic thing you think of. The biggest risk in industrial accidents, and at least in construction, is falling down and getting injured or killed. So I'm just wondering, was there any attempt on the part of the Army authorities on either side to establish safety regulations to keep these things from happening? I'm sure that the Army nowadays has lots of safety regulations, and officers are in charge of making sure their subordinates adhere to these regulations. But was there any attempt at that time, or was it just kind of pure chaos?
Well, I don't know that it was pure chaos. There were different manuals and practices, best practices that one followed. I mentioned that Pender at one point was a glorified drill sergeant. It was because he had some military training and was taking people that didn't have any and trying to turn them into soldiers. Thomas will say at one point when he's in Kentucky trying to take the raw farm boys and turn them into soldiers, that he will do, that's the reason he trusted them, as he came to know that he had prepared them, he had gotten them ready. There were manuals, there were rules, there were, again, attempts to try to teach, the smarter behavior. I mean, especially in terms of, drill and everything else. But so much of this stuff is being done with numbers that are unprecedented. If you think about the numbers of troops that are being brought together, the numbers of troops that are being transported, the numbers of troops that are going to be engaged, it dwarfs anything that had ever been seen before. And I think that that kind of size of the whole operation just became overwhelming. I don't want to say chaotic, because of course it had an order of its own, but you know, there's going to be time to sort of assess and reassess once everything's over. But while you're in the middle of it, you've got bigger things to do. You got other things to do. That's, again, not to say that they're not regulations, that they go in the official records. You'll be amazed at the type of attempts that officers will make to regulate behavior, to try to, you know, do things to try to bring some order. Again, I think your point about chaos, to bring some order out of chaos and impose some order that makes some sense on the circumstances. But, you know, so many of these are practices that are occurring at the moment that are, it's almost like they don't have time to deal with the other possible ramifications, because if in the end, most of the people you want arriving where they need to arrive will arrive, the handful of folks that don't, the relative handful that won't, you know, you don't have time to mourn the losses of those individuals until, again, everything's over. And that's sometimes when people are more reflective and try to be more disciplined. I mean, Forrest, I'll just give you an example. For Forrest, he will tell people not to race their horses through camp, not because he's trying to regulate whether they'd run into anybody. He doesn't want them to wear the horses out. So it's practical. They'll tell people don't shoot off your weapons just to be shooting them off, because unless you really want to try to work on target practice or sharpshooting or whatever, you're wasting ammunition. There was nobody more absorbed with avoiding waste than George Henry Thomas. That was really his whole focus, was to do things by the book and do things in the right way that weren't going to produce wasteful results. And he had learned that from the earliest days. In his earliest days in the U.S. military, he had been both the post commander and the post everything else. And he had basically had to deal with, you know, writing reports about why he could order what he had ordered and why he couldn't get what he couldn't get, and justifying it and everything else. It built into him this mindset that, you know, you cannot, you've got to be organized. You've got to be methodical. You've got to be under a control, in the sense of controlling the resources. And so I think that's the answer. I mean, there are people that are going to, in one of the books, one of the images, Nick Berserna, I don't know if Nick's still here or not, but one of the things he gave me for the book that's credited in the book is a man that we think was sleepwalking and walked off the ship he was traveling on and drowned himself. So here's a guy that, you know, again, if there'd been somebody paying attention to safety, maybe he doesn't walk off the vessel and drown himself. So, you know, did that mean there were no regulations? Well, of course not. But in his case, you know, the circumstances just didn't fit, the situation didn't fit the safety. It fit, you know, unfortunately, a more open situation that led to his demise. But I see Nick still there. Nick, thank you so much for that image. That was really a powerful image, and an important thing I love to talk about that, you know, as being, again, this fellow who went off to war and didn't come back home, but it was not because he fell to an enemy shot or shell. He fell because he may have been sleepwalking and walked off the end of a vessel.
Fascinating. Those are some great stories. Thanks for those questions, and thanks to everybody who asked the questions. We really appreciate you guys participating. Mr. Swain mentioned that somebody asked about regulations and bulletins and that kind of thing. And he said for the movements of the 11th and 12th Corps to Chattanooga in 1863, the USMRR posted a few of what could be called bulletins, safety bulletins, outlining practices to keep soldiers safe. So maybe we'll hear about some of that next week when he does the presentation for us. So I'll be interested to know what those are. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that would probably be far off the topic of artillery tactics. I'm full of just useless information about the Civil War.
That's all right. That's great. We love useless information. All right, let's see. We're going to go ahead and get back to our screen so that we can show those books again, because folks are asking about them. And we want to thank you so much for being here with us this week. We enjoyed having you. And thank you so much for the presentation and for answering all the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Don't forget that all of our guests provide these presentations without compensation. So we always encourage folks to purchase your own copy of the books. And Dr. Wills has some great ones. The ones he mainly talked about tonight: Inglorious Passages, Noncombat Deaths in the Civil War, and Confederate General William Dorsey Pender, The Hope of Glory. And the instructions for purchasing are there in the chat box. You can, like he said, you can purchase them from Amazon if you like, or you can order directly from him and tell him how you'd like them inscribed, and he'll do that for you. And the instructions and the payment method is there. And I'm going to share that slide again in a minute that has the different, the pricing for the different books. And of course, the best biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederacy's Greatest Cavalryman, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And if you're a George Thomas fan, you need a copy of Dr. Wills' George Henry Thomas's True as Steel on your bookshelf. And for those interested in Fort Pillow, The River Was Dyed with Blood, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Fort Pillow. And of course, all of those are available through that same process that we just talked about. And what's the name of the book that you showed us at the very end? The Civil War?
Oh, Gone with the Glory.
Gone with the Glory. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that one up, but we'll show it again in a minute. So be sure to order the books and get them on your shelf, and go ahead and read those, because you'll be glad you did. And again, many thanks to Dr. Wills for being with us here tonight and answering the questions. It was a great program, and we enjoyed having you very, very much. And we've got some other promotions. Let's see, coming up a few weeks ago, our friend Norman Daysinger was our guest, and we appreciate all of his contributions to the production of this weekly series. And he has a tour coming up July 8th through the 10th of it's a Chickamauga tour, part of Blue and Gray Education Society's new Civil War 101 series. Everything you always wanted to know about Chickamauga in a weekend. That's July 8th through 10th at Chickamauga with Norman Daysinger Jr. So register for that if you're looking for Chickamauga. Oops, I skipped one. Sorry about that, Craig. The next Civil War Presents will be on January 12th, when our guest will be Craig Swain. Craig, I'm going to bring you to the screen so you can tell us about the program. Craig is the author of that fantastic blog, the genius behind it, The Sound of the Guns, and you won't want to miss this program. What are you going to tell us about, Craig?
Well, as the title says, they're field artillery tactics. One of these days, when I do finally get the free time from work to write a book, it's probably going to be about field artillery tactics. It's going to be it'll probably be a tome. It'll be a multi-volume set or something. But really, my take on this, American field artillery tactics, we've got a little bit of different spin than the European tactics of the time period. And I'll make the case there why our tactics were different, what influenced it. And along the way, I'll discuss some things like, why the American Napoleon cannon maybe was only about 1/4 French. We tend to think it was just, we just copied the French. I will make the case that it wasn't a deliberate copy. There was a little bit more to it, and that's reflective of the tactics that we had.
Great. Well, we're sure looking forward to that. Everybody's been talking about it, and everybody's looking forward to the presentation. I know I am. On January 19th, we have another special program coming to you. Our friend Ron Coddington, editor and publisher of Military Images magazine, will be back with us. And he is bringing, you won't believe this, a panel of 9 premier image collectors. And this panel each person will bring their favorite Civil War era image. So that's no small task, just to choose the image from your collection that's your favorite. But they'll be bringing their favorite, and they'll be sharing the story behind that face. And our last image, we had an image collector showcase back in July that was really well attended. It was a sellout. So be sure if you want to attend this one to go on the Civil War Talk website, go ahead and pull up that calendar entry and get registered because seating is limited. And I know you don't want to miss it. It's going to be great. Living Shadows of the Passing Time. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Wills. We enjoyed it. And I hope to see everybody on Wednesday, January 12th at 8:30 with Craig Swain on Civil War field artillery tactics. And again, many thanks to Dr. Wills. See you on January 12th.
See everybody later.